Hello, I think we're now live with our audience. So welcome everybody to this third webinar from our series of 5 with the Critical Infrastructure, Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre. We've got a fantastic array of panellists today with a focus on environmental security. Before I begin though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. In Canberra, there's a few of us here and we're on the land of the Ngunnawal people. And I know we've got people joining us from right across Australia. So acknowledge those traditional owners and thank you very much to everybody for participating. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us online today. So as I said, we've got a great array of guests speaking with us today about environmental security. We've been focusing on various aspects of security related issues for owners and operators of critical infrastructure. And so today I'll introduce you to our fantastic panellists. So first we have Sam GRUNHARD. Sam is the Deputy Head of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre at the Department of Home Affairs. Welcome, Sam. We've also got BRIANNA Casey. BRIANNA is the Chief Executive Officer for FoodBank. So pleased to have you here with us today, BRIANNA. Thank you. And we've got Andrew Chandler, who's the first Assistant Coordinator General for National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA. Welcome to you, Andrew. Great to have you here. So the webinar structure is very much the same as what we've run in the last couple, where we are very much wanting to hear from our audience the questions that you have in relation to this issue. We know that Australia is a very lucky country in many ways, but we've been dealing with so many different disasters over the last few years. It feels like they've been rolling and endless, one after the other, from various climate-related issues to COVID-19, and all of those have affected our critical infrastructure organisations quite significantly. So today we'd like to speak to our clever panellists and understand from their perspectives what those impacts have been, but also to talk about some insights of how they've overcome some of the challenges and what they recommend for other owner-operators of critical infrastructure. So the first question probably goes to all of you, and I might start with Sam in relation to that, but I'd also encourage our audience to please make sure you're putting your questions through to us so that we can get to as many as possible today in the hour that we have with you. So Sam, really we're understanding, what do you think organisations need to do now to strengthen organisational resilience, and particularly in relation to climatic events that have been a continuing theme for us the last few years?
Thanks so much, Leanne, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's been a great series of webinars so far. I'm really glad to have you all with us, and thanks to BRIANNA and Andrew also for joining us. It has been, as you said, Leanne, a really dreadful couple of years, let's face it. You know, constant shocks to our systems, constant shocks to our critical infrastructure, to our delivery of services, to maintain our way of life. Now, I think we've got through it admirably, but it has been just tremendously challenging. And I know many of you on the line would have been dealing with the successive bushfires, floods, pandemic, supply chain disruptions that we've all been dealing with, in addition to a worsening cyber threat environment as well. So lots of things to balance, and I think one of the things organisations are really struggling with is how to prioritise risk amongst those different hazards. You know, we talk about an all hazards approach, and that's certainly government's approach to risk in critical infrastructure in particular, but it's easier said than done. So some of the things we're trying to do to assist industry is give better information and guidance about how to think about prioritising the different risks, including climate risks. Many of you may have seen the sectoral risk advisories that we published on our website just in the last couple of months for each critical infrastructure sector, which try to give you a sense of not only the different hazards that you face, but a way to think about prioritising them, and indeed an initial prioritisation for each sector of how those threats sit. And of course, climate is very high on the list of impacts that we know are coming and will have really significant consequences. So we'd certainly be encouraging everyone to think about, as an organisation, how do you, what is your governance internally around how you balance climate risk against some of the other risks you face? Now, of course, it's not just about advice. Through the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre and through recent changes to legislation, increasingly government will be imposing regulatory requirements on various critical infrastructure owners and operators to ensure that they are taking those things into account. And many of you will know we've been consulting at the moment on the draft risk management program rules to talk about how to incorporate those risks into your internal governance and how to get them to the attention of board level for sign off that the organisation is doing the right thing. So that's a big part of the work we're doing at the moment. And one of the questions we've been asking industry, Leanne, is how we need to best balance that relationship between regulation, which government does not want to be prescriptive and frankly never will be prescriptive under the way the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act is set up, as against advice and guidance, which we're also trying to give. The other key method of getting advice is to make sure you're involved in the Trusted Information Sharing Network. Anyone who's on the line who's not involved in a TISN group, please do contact us. It's so important. It's your doorway into a whole bunch of different government agencies, whether it be the Bureau of Meteorology, particularly for climate risk, or Geoscience Australia, ASIO. Obviously, Andrew's colleagues in NEMA are going to be incredibly important as we go through the next couple of years of potential disruptions. So it's your way to come into the front door and then coordinate with a whole range of other government agencies, as well as to talk to your colleagues and competitors in some cases in each sector. So I really encourage you to be in those conversations if you're not in them. Last thing I'll say is the strength. I think our strength as a country over the last couple of years through all these shocks has been the engagement and the collaboration we have. I mean, I think Andrew, Brianna and I have all survived some pretty tough conversations over the last few years through COVID in particular. And it's no pre-baked advisory or bit of legislation is going to get us through that. What's going to get us through it is the collaboration we all have. So if you're not involved in the conversation about these things, I really would encourage you to get involved any way you can. Leanne, I could talk forever, but I'm not going to because I really want to get to other people. So back to you.
Thank you, Sam. And yeah, we probably will touch on a couple of those other aspects you talked about there as we talk through the issues today. So Brianna, for you, what sort of the key sort of messages you would give organisations in terms of organisational resilience?
Thanks, Leanne, and I just want to acknowledge country. I'm coming to you today from beautiful Darug country and wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. First and foremost, and I think in particular Andrew's going to roll his eyes at this one, I'm not going to use the R word today. I think that we have heard it used, and I think that there is a real sensitivity amongst communities at the moment about an expectation of what they can do in order, okay, I'll mention it once, in order to be more resilient. But certainly from FoodBank's point of view, I really want to echo and really support the comments that Sam has made about the power, the influence and the risk management and preparedness that can be achieved through engaging with the TISN structures. The Trusted Information Sharing Network for FoodBank is a really interesting experience because we are not traditionally seen as part of the food and grocery infrastructure network. We are a food relief organisation. We operate at scale, so we're a non-government organisation, a for-purpose organisation, but we're responsible for sourcing 48 million kilograms of food and grocery items each year. We're supporting more than 1 million Australians at the moment with food relief, and we are operating in some of the most fragile surprise chains that are known to man. We don't have supply chains at FoodBank, we have surprise chains. So we don't know what we're going to have donated to us in terms of food and grocery items year in, year out, day in, day out. And we need to find ways to convert those surprise chains into supply chains, particularly in times of crisis. What we've seen at FoodBank over the last few years is a period of long, successive, damaging droughts that have really affected our ability to source essential food products, particularly from farm, but also an increase in demand for food relief across those rural and regional communities that really needed our support and assistance. We then rolled into the devastating bushfires that we saw in 2019 and 20. And I think one of the biggest lessons that we learnt through that period was how critically important it was for us to work in partnership and collaboration with all levels of government, but also our stakeholder peers and networks, because one of the biggest criticisms that we heard from communities through that period was they were being inundated with unsolicited donations of products that they simply didn't need or didn't have the capacity to handle. And what I loved through that period, through our involvement with the food and grocery sector group in Tizen, through our relationships through national coordination mechanisms, FoodBank was used as a way to channel and filter the enthusiasm and well-meaning contributions of the community to make sure that the right products were getting to the right places at the right times and in the right volumes and quantities, so that we were actually supporting and enhancing the work of local communities and authorities, not burdening them. So I think then rolling into COVID and then into these successive floods, I think what we've observed as a food relief organisation, natural disaster relief and emergency relief used to be a small part of what we did. The day in, day out support for people in hardship was the big focus. We've gone from natural disaster season being 2 to 3 months a year to really at least 10 months a year. So for us, having access to Bureau of Meteorology data, long-term climate data, enables us to do better planning, so that we can forecast better the volumes and types of food relief that we need. So we got early intel about where the floods were going to be over the last few months. It allowed the likes of FoodBank New South Wales and ACT to pre-position pallets of food relief into communities, to work with local governments, to work with local charities, to make sure those food and grocery items were already there. Because one thing is for certain with our fragile supply chains in this country, we know road and rail will go out, so we need to get ahead of that. So I can't commend more highly the importance of that early intelligence that we can get around climate. But I think what we need to recognise as stakeholders, as government and as community groups coming together, this is about dealing with a polycrisis now. We've got an income crisis happening at the same time as a cost of living crisis and a climate crisis, and the ability of communities and critical infrastructure operators to deal with all three of those at once is being compromised. So it's about ensuring we've got good planning, good data, good networks, so that we can have the greatest impact on communities as we do respond to these crises. I'm a bit like Sam, I could talk all day, but over to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And again, it's really evident, you know, the public-private partnership perspective that comes from both what you and Sam have been saying has been critical. Australia's mighty, but we're small in terms of our population and other things. So all of us having worked together is really clearly critical. Andrew, you've had a huge amount of experience in disaster relief support, coordinating these sorts of entities through COVID, but also natural disasters in your current work now. So what are some of the insights you'd like to share with us in relation to how we can continue to strengthen those sorts of organisational word issues?
Yeah, look, thank you very much, Leanne, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's a really important opportunity for us to continue this conversation, and I'm really grateful to be part of it, so thank you for that. Obviously, Sam's touched on a number of the formal mechanisms, so I won't repeat what he's talked about there, but can I just endorse absolutely what both he and Brianna said. They're really important things that they've covered off on, so I won't go through that. But look, generally, I think what we've seen, certainly over the course of the last 12 months, but going back even further than that, particularly with regard to supply chains, is this general acceptance, the need to move from just in time to just in case, but really it's so much more than that in terms of preparing for what we're facing. I like to use a bit of an analogy. We all have house insurance, which, you know, is hopefully a bit helpful when something really bad happens, but really what's really important is actually cleaning your gutters. You've got to do that preparation ahead of time to try and ensure that the bad things don't happen. Insurance helps if it does, but really it's not going to actually stop those things from happening. It's really about ensuring you know what is happening, and Brianna really sort of touched on this, and we do know what's coming. We do know the sort of risks that we're going to face, and Sam's talked about some of the products and some of the support that the government is providing there. But in terms of critical infrastructure or industry, it's critically important, I think, that you really map out your vulnerabilities and actually go through a careful process of doing that, of understanding what your vulnerabilities are. Now, sometimes that's an issue of supply chain, sometimes it's an issue of power supply, whatever it might be. You actually need to go through that process for your entity about mapping what your vulnerabilities are, and then actually investing in mitigation. And that doesn't necessarily mean actually infrastructure investment. It may be systems, you name it. It may be networks, it may be establishing relationships, but you've got to invest in the mitigation for those vulnerabilities. The other thing that I can't emphasise enough is exercising the response of your organisation in terms of actually dealing with the sorts of scenarios that we know are coming. We know they're coming at us. I mean, we've experienced it a lot over the last few years, but there's only going to be more. Exercise, train your staff, but most importantly, actively prepare and engage with the sorts of issues that we're talking about. Entities need to actually critically look at what they're facing and actively engage in that. It's so very, very important. A key component of that, though, is understanding the systems that are around to support and assist, but critically also the relationships and the networks. One of the mechanisms we haven't touched on is the National Coordination Mechanism. It's something that NEMA runs in the face of impending impending crises or events that have already occurred, working closely with industry and the states and territories and Commonwealth as necessary to address specific issues. And that's a mechanism that works really well, but it works so much better if we've got established relationships in those areas. And it's a two-way street. We can reach out, and we do, but likewise, if there are things that you think you need to be engaging with and need to understand from a Commonwealth perspective, we need you to reach out as well. I might stop there, but also very happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Andrew. And I've got a couple of other questions that I would like to touch on for each of you, but before I get to those, Kit certainly provided an early question to us, and Kit's question is in relation to the specific mechanics that organisations, I guess particularly around the Cyber Infrastructure Security Centre and NEMA as well, but Brianna also asking what sort of mechanisms do you use to ensure compliance with environmental security controls, particularly with your service vendors? And the example there is around security controls for fire, flood or other major events. So maybe Brianna first.
Oh, look, for us, it's about knowing every part of the supply chain from paddock to plate and how best we can mitigate risks along those spaces. So for us, it's about understanding what our food and grocery donors on farm, in the supply chains from a transport and logistics point of view, in the manufacturing sector, as well as the retailers are doing to prepare themselves. From a compliance point of view, food safety is our absolute focus. We need to ensure, particularly given we are providing food relief to the most vulnerable in our community, that we are compliant every step of the way in terms of how we are handling, transporting, distributing and monitoring food relief distribution and how it's handled ongoing. But for us, it's about really genuine partnerships with the almost 3,000 charities that we traditionally distribute our food relief through, and understanding that we are a trusted voice in community so that we can be part of those conversations around how local governments, how schools, how frontline charities are engaging with this process as well. I think it's really important to understand that in these times of crisis, it's also about having a paid and an unpaid workforce. For us at FoodBank, without having an extraordinary volunteer network across the country, we simply wouldn't be able to do what we do. So it's about having strong induction processes. It's about ensuring that we've got strong controls and measures and policies in everything that we do around cyber risk, around transportation and handling of food, around the way that we are partnering with very commercial brands and ensuring that their products are being used and their brand risk isn't being compromised as well. So it's an incredibly robust process. But I think, and we've talked about this in previous webinars in the context of cybersecurity, it's about understanding the capacity of each of the sectors and stakeholders that we're dealing with. And I do think one of the sleeper issues that we'll get to over time through these webinars and beyond is around the capacity of Australia's charity network and the fact that we've become almost a formal part of the response to natural disasters. What sort of capacity building needs to go on to make sure, for example, cybersecurity and cyber risk is being addressed, noting that we have more than 60,000 registered charities across Australia? How are we making sure we are all working together to lift that capacity and posturing as a whole, not just separately?
Thank you for that. And I'd also just note for our audience that we've posted a few links to some of the information sources that you can get. Sam, we've posted things from the Trusted Information Network, Sharing Network, and some of the other things from your website. Is there anything else that you really wanted to add, though, in terms of some of those issues around security controls and sharing of information?
I couldn't do better than the way BRIANNA outlined what she actually does within the organisation. The challenge is fundamentally, as with everything, it's about people, right? It's a people management challenge and a governance challenge within each organisation. I mean, you can go and look at things like ISO 31000 if you want to pull out an international standard and start there. There's also, frankly, plenty of players in the market who are happy to provide advice on these sort of issues, but I mean, ultimately it's about making sure you're carving out time to have those conversations internally, and also to make sure people understand where responsibility lies. As Andrew was observing before, at the time a crisis hits is not the time to be working out, am I responsible for this, or is somebody else who's got the lead on this particular issue? How do I reach them in a crisis? You know, almost talking about basic business continuity planning in a way, but analysing things like your supply chain weaknesses, your vulnerabilities, the things that you absolutely cannot do without, and the things that you can afford some disruption to, and triaging those, as well as really clearly assigning responsibilities and communication pathways in advance, I think are sort of the sort of basic hygiene that everybody needs to engage in, particularly as we know we're going to be facing increased climate disruption, coupled with the cyber disruption, which can be a very difficult confluence, and we saw that through some of the recent floods and through COVID with ransomware impacts happening at the same time, for example. So you know, it's a challenging environment. I think the more conversations you can have in advance, the better positioned you'll be.
Thank you. Andrew, I've got probably a couple of questions for you, one from our audience member in a moment, but we know that the National Emergency Management Agency was established with the bringing together of Emergency Management Australia and the Bushfire Recovery Agency. So what do you think are some of the benefits that industry will see from the combination and the establishment of this new body?
Yeah, look, great, thank you. Well, you've just covered my first sentence of my standard response to what NEMA is doing, which is great. So obviously the message is getting out there, and that's fantastic. So that's really good. Look, I think in terms of what we are already seeing out of the establishment of NEMA is really a single joined up approach to emergency management, and that's really across the full continuum of the emergency management spectrum. Now that has direct effects in terms of the impact on the ground. We see in terms, you know, if we're doing immediate response to using the current example, the floods, and what happens there in terms of the response capabilities tying in directly with the recovery capabilities and the smooth transition there. So I think that's a critically important component of it. I think the other key advantage that we get of having it all together in one space is, and it enables us to actually take a more strategic approach and be more proactive in terms of what we're doing. I've touched on a couple of the, I touched on the national coordination mechanism. That is something that is maturing, and integrating that both at the sort of response and the recovery level has made a significant difference with a number of the recent events that have occurred. In terms of some specific programs, I'm sure everyone's heard of the Disaster Ready Fund, which the new government announced when it was established. It's $200 million per annum, specifically designed for projects and programs to support resilience within the community. But that's $200 million from the federal government. That is matched by $200 million from the states as well, and so that's not often mentioned. So there's $400 billion there. Nearly $500 million in terms of investment per annum in those sort of resilience sort of initiatives. Likewise, there's a fair bit of work happening on a range of things, such as the very thorny question of insurance and underinsurance and the cost of insurance for communities when they're facing these sorts of disasters. And again, the floods provides another good example of where there's been lots of media coverage of late around, just the cost of insurance, or indeed whether or not insurance can be provided in certain circumstances. There's a whole program of work around risk reduction, which NEAN was working through. You will see that publicised in the second national risk reduction, the second National Action Plan, which will come out at some stage next year. And really that's focused around reducing risk that we face as a nation writ large. One of the key themes of that, though, will be around shared responsibility. And Sam touched on this earlier, really, that, what are the responsibilities of the federal government, the state government, the community more broadly, but also industry as well. So they are some of the key things, I think, which we'll see the benefits that emerge out of the recently established new national organisation. There are a number of internal capabilities that we're working on, which are maturing as well, which I can touch on as necessary as we go forward. But thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And everyone's actually touched on this question by Nick, but I think it's really important that we again emphasise his question here around organisations are planning their work and their operations, and they have a lot of interdependencies with other organisations. And you touched on this, especially Brianna. How important is it that plans are compatible with other organisations and in that supply chain or in the the subcontractor environment of organisations that you work with? So maybe one for Brianna.
Oh, spot on, and well said, Nick. It's exactly at the core of why groups like FoodBank are so important in this discussion. If we look at the Victorian government, who I have to say has been exemplary in terms of formally activating and recognising in their state disaster plan or equivalent the important role of formally activating FoodBank Victoria and Red Cross in partnership to deliver emergency food relief in times of crisis. It means that the role is formalised, it is organised, and it means that rather than individual organisations or local councils or well-meaning individuals in towns and communities asking the world for help randomly, it is about understanding a really structured way to play that particular role on food relief. And it means that the likes of Woolies, Coles, Aldi, Metcash and other businesses that are often hit up with 15, 20, 50 requests for assistance can simply say, we're on it. We're doing that through FoodBank. It means that it's through reducing the burden on them in terms of having to do a scattergun approach. It means that the right products are going into community. But you can only have these conversations if you are formally built into a formalised structure. And what we've seen throughout successive crises is our ability to respond as government and non-government organisations is as strong as the planning beforehand. And I think you've heard that consistently throughout the group. When there are strong preparedness efforts that are documented so that it's a matter of pressing play and doing what you do best. I wish we weren't as well rehearsed and as experienced as we are in disaster response at the moment. But when these floods have hit again and again, I mean, the one positive, I guess, in floods is that we do tend to have a little bit of lead time when it comes to riverine flooding, and we can get ahead of it. And I know FoodBank South Australia is incredibly busily preparing for the Murray coming through and what we're going to see throughout those river country areas. But we can't do it alone, and we need to make sure that all government agencies are pulling on the same chain, because the worst thing that we can see in communities that are already vulnerable, and let's be really honest here, when it comes to natural disasters, the most vulnerable in our communities suffer worst, first, and for the longest. And we need to do whatever we can to make sure that their experience is lifted in some way. And what they don't want to see is that no one's in charge. What they don't want to see is that there is duplication of effort and gaps. They want to know that someone's got them, that they're going to wrap their arms around them, and that there's going to be a coordinated, structured response. And again, the national coordination mechanism for FoodBank has been a game changer. What we saw in the South Australian floods, when both road and rail access from Adelaide into Darwin and across to Perth was taken out at the same time, we were able to jump onto the National Coordination Mechanism, work with the likes of Primary Connect, work with the likes of Aldi, Coles, Metcash, state governments, territory governments, to make sure we could still get food relief into our Central Australia hub in Alice Springs, so that that community wasn't compromised by the realities of supply chain disruption. We can't do that on our own. We don't have that. We are so dependent upon pro bono and low bono support. And when supply chains go out, that's the most expensive and difficult problem to solve. We can't do it without that support. And if we didn't have those relationships, we couldn't do what we do.
Thanks, Brianna. And taking that point a bit further, Russ has raised a good point in relation to some of the aspects you talked about earlier, Brianna, but I'll probably throw this one to Sam, actually, where Russ mentions that there is a lot of dependencies on charities in responding to crises, and they haven't got a lot of infrastructure and other support internally often. And Russ asks, what are the ways that government potentially could explore more formal advice and support to charities, particularly, for example, in cybersecurity? I know this would have been an issue that was discussed at our last webinar with the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, who have that role in supporting agencies and organisations. But I guess, yeah, how could we support charities as a sector, do you think, Sam?
Thanks, Leanne, and I'll defer to Brianna and Andrew really on that, because they know far more about it than I do. I do think we could be doing more. It's interesting to think about the role of something like the ACSC, which does publish a lot of really helpful, quite basic guidance, which I think could help organisations. But you know, perhaps there's a desire to maybe sort of duplicate their communication function so that we can get them in the faces of more people directly, because sometimes that human to human interaction and the ability to ask questions really makes a big difference. I might just also add something on that previous point about dependency on others. I think one of the things that worries me the most as we talk to organisations is sometimes there's a failure of the imagination, and maybe the pandemic has demonstrated this to us, that people often analyse their own organisational risk and their own organisational dependencies in a bubble that suggests if something goes wrong, it only goes wrong for them, and they can go talk to another organisation or a competitor or someone else in the space who will be perfectly functioning and will be able to assist. And instead, what you need to imagine is a scenario where everybody's been hit by the same problem, be it an environmental crisis, a pandemic, a cyber attack that doesn't just hit your business but hits the other businesses you depend on or might turn to for assistance. So a bit of imagination around hazards that can impact not just your organisation but a whole sector or across sectors, unfortunately, is needed. Now, that doesn't mean you can worry about every conceivable risk, because that's a way to do nothing at all. Don't prioritise alien invasion, but do think about the most likely risk that could impact not just you, but the others in your sector. But Len, I'm really interested in Andrew's thoughts on that question about support to charities too.
Agreed. And Andrew and Sam, I always say alien invasion will bring humanity together, if nothing else, but probably not a topic for today. Andrew, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, look, we're just dusting off our plans on the alien invasion, but it's probably at a level that I can't share with everyone here. Sorry, joking for those who are not aware. Look, thank you very much. Look, to Sam's point to start with, one of the things that I think sometimes gets overlooked, and we see this time and time again, and maybe it's not so, well, it's really come to the fore, I guess, through COVID, but is remember your staff. They are members of the community. They are individuals, and a lot of what we see with a lot of planning is people worry about their supply chains and what have you, and then when a crisis hits, if your staff members are, lifting their furniture off the floor or have COVID or whatever it is, suddenly you find that actually your most critical vulnerability is actually the humans in your organisation, and often that gets forgotten because we just don't necessarily take account of the fact that the crisis writ large will not only affect other entities and other organisations and services around us, but will also hit the humans that actually we work with. And so that's a really important one to bear in mind as well. In terms of the support to charities, particularly from a cyber perspective, as Sam's flagged there, the ACSC is really the key point where that support and assistance is centralised. There's some pretty basic things that can be done to really make quite a significant difference. That applies to organisations, it applies to individuals as well. But in the main, if their guidance is followed, it really makes quite a significant difference in terms of what the vulnerabilities are that you face. What it might mean is that, a bit like installing an alarm on your house, that just means that the burglar goes next door. But, hey, that's something that individual entities might actually be interested in. So it's really worth taking account of what it is that the ACSC puts out. We are also doing a bit of work within NEMA around how we can better work to coordinate with charities in the not-for-profit sector in terms of some of the tasking that Brianna talked about, the great work that FoodBank does in terms of coordination, for example, on behalf of the suppliers that Woolworths or whoever might provide. We're trying to do a bit more around putting in place systems there. Obviously, the federal government has no real authority in terms of actual hard levers that we can pull, but we do have a convening power and a coordination role, and we can assist in that space. And so we are working with a range of different entities there. That's really an extension of what NEMA does in terms of coordinating the federal support that the Commonwealth Government provides to states and territories when a disaster hits and they request when.
Thanks, Andrew. Brianna, really keen to get your thoughts on this, but I also note that Julia has volunteered her expertise as cybersecurity expert, and she's interested in putting a hand up there. So I'd probably push Julia to your website and the job section, but it's fantastic to get these sorts of offers of support.
Thank you. And yes, please inundate us with offers of assistance. We love it. I mean, the wonderful thing about charities more broadly, we are always dependent on time, treasure and talent. And that time piece is volunteering, and it could be practical volunteering in the warehouse in FoodBank's case, but also skilled volunteering. Please don't underestimate how powerful and immeasurably valuable skilled volunteering is to the charity sector. If you're a guru in cyber, in tax policy, in marketing, in comms, it's an extraordinarily powerful way to have huge impact on charities that just don't have the budget to spend in that space. So yes, please contact us, jump on our website or email me or drop me a LinkedIn DM, always keen to hear. But I think it's really important to recognise that this cross-functional all hazards approach that we've been talking about right from the beginning is at the core of all of this, because I think what COVID has shown us better than anything, as has these current floods, if we are not coordinating well, planning well, I've absolutely loved seeing what's happened with NEMA, the establishment of NEMA, the direction it's taking, the all hazards approach, and really looking to engage every aspect of the sector. I think I'll be slightly controversial for a moment, but it's a soapbox I've stood on for a long time. What I've loved about TISN is it's thought about so many different pieces of critical infrastructure. What we don't have is social infrastructure. We don't have a TISN that looks at risks to and threatening behaviours that could impact on the effectiveness of our social infrastructure across Australia. And I think what we have really seen and continue to see is without frontline charities, without the social services network, without community organisations who are trusted voices in communities and have so much influence, I think it's just a wonderful way for us to be able to, one, acknowledge the role of the social glue that holds us together in communities, but two, to recognise if we are going to look at risk to critical infrastructure, That's a big risk. What happens if we lose those organisations that are supporting the most vulnerable in our community? What are the costs, both directly to them and to our community?
Thank you. And this next question from Wayne is one that we were thinking about earlier as well. We saw that in the floods earlier this year that there were some real impacts on highways going out through the floods. For example, some trucks we heard had to take like a 3,000 kilometre detour around to get food and groceries from Adelaide up to Darwin. And so we've also seen the other impacts that COVID-19 put on supply chains, etc. Wayne's question goes to that a little bit, where he's talking about the evaluation of natural risks and security risks to critical infrastructure requires a range of studies and thought by organisations. And what are your expectations with respect to having an all risks approach in a risk management program, or should, you know, are they just going to continue to grow over time and be progressively added? So maybe Sam first.
Thanks, Leanne, and thanks, Wayne. Yeah, it's a good question. I think as an example where we can risk sending a message that the perfect should be the enemy of the good, which is certainly not our intention. I think sometimes the phrase "all hazards" is perceived in that way. It suggests you have to be a master of every possible risk that could impact your business and make sure you eliminate them all. And it's not what we're meaning to communicate, certainly. So it's a really interesting and a really timely question. I think my answer would be it's all about prioritisation. We'd absolutely recommend you not wait until you think you can master all possible risks, all possible hazards that can impact your organisation. Start at the top, work your way down. If that takes some time for you to feel like you've got a grip on them all, fine. Start with the most likely and or the most consequential. And again, those sector risk advisories we've published try to set out for you both likelihood and consequence of the particular hazards to your sector, so they can be a guide to how you might start through that prioritisation process. Having said that, if you yourself or you talk to people in your organisation, you're likely to have a pretty good sense of the hazards that are most likely to disrupt the operation of your organisation. Worth crowd sharing that conversation to make sure you're not just engaging in groupthink, but you know, through some discovery process, you will come to a pretty firm conclusion about the most likely and also the most consequential, leaving aside alien invasion. And interesting conversations over the last few years about the extent to which people were or were not prepared for pandemic. You get outside of the health sector, the impact, as Andrew was saying, was really primarily on the availability of staff themselves. And so it's worth thinking about, you know, the different vectors that could all produce the same outcome, which is your staff are not available. I mean, we also had a brief period of time where staff were less available to their organisation because they were worried about finding food at the supermarket. And funnily enough, that was their priority, not getting to work on time. So, you know, there's a range of hazards that can impact different consequence areas for your business, and it's worth having a triage conversation about that within your organisation.
Thanks, Sam. Anything else from Brianna or Andrew on that particular one before we move on? Brianna?
Sam's spot on, and I think Andrew highlighted it first. You know, our teams are the most important component and the biggest risk to business continuity planning, etc. We saw it most recently with the flooding that took hold in northwest Victoria. It affected dairy farms, so it was affecting access of agronomists and vets getting onto farm to deal with mastitis and foot rot and so on. But we saw it in the milk processing facilities as well. And whilst they did have to close for a short period of time because of electricity shortages, what ultimately led to the extended closure or extended period of reduced production was team members not being able to access the site, not being able to traverse roads that had been damaged, bridges that had gone, looking to look after their own homes as well. So I think, and I'm really noting that Sam must have grown up as an X-Files fan, but pending the alien invasion, I do think it is about considering what are the risks to our people, what is the risk to the business, what is the biggest barrier to business continuity, and how do we manage our resources accordingly? Because we could waste immeasurable time and burn serious coin and lead to exhaustion, scenario planning every risk under the sun that could affect us. We know that there are going to be some risks that are going to be more likely than others. Certainly from a FoodBank point of view, we know there are going to be more and more natural disasters. We know there is going to be increased demand for food relief as we see the cost of living crisis continue. We need to prepare for that as best we can. We need to acknowledge that there are going to be bumps in the road along the way, and just make sure that our teams understand that that is normal, that is to be expected, and that we're here to support them through it, and that we are tapped into the right processes to be able to respond effectively.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left today with the webinar, and probably my final question for each of you will be just trying to focus on one of those sort of key priority areas, the top 3 that you think organisations need to prepare for. We're still dealing with floods, as you've all identified. We're still looking at, you know, potential cyclones. We've had damaging winds, hail and other issues coming forward, as well as the issues you've identified there, Andrew and Brianna, in terms of staff and the fact that people are still unwell. And so people having to balance their priorities in terms of staffing and resourcing, etc. So I guess, Andrew, starting with you, what would be the 3 sort of key takeaway messages you'd like to give to our audience today in relation to preparedness as we move into the Christmas season?
Look, Leanne, thank you very much. Well, I think you've really hit it in your question, in the sense that it's really about preparedness to actually actively engage and make sure that you're not just hoping or just taking out your insurance policy. You've actually got to actively try and address the risks and the threats that we face as we go into the Christmas season. We would all be well aware, except perhaps those in the southwest corner of WA, that you know, the rain is going to continue. You know, floods will continue. We've seen it go slowly down the Murray. At the top end, it was not so slow, but certainly South Australia's had plenty of time to prepare, and that is still coming. That will continue throughout the Christmas and holiday season. That having been said, there will also, you know, there's also significant potential for bushfires, particularly in southwest WA and Western Tasmania. But with all of that also comes risks for cyclone and the like. And so there's some of the natural sort of hazards that are facing us over the next few months. And Sam's laid out some of the material in terms of risk and what have you that is provided. I think what we've seen over the last couple of months, though, is that the cyber risk is pretty significant, and certainly that's not going to go away. And the other thing is the one which we've been talking about towards the back end of this discussion is really just those risks that are going to impact on your staff, because at the end of the day, none of us can do this without our staff. And we just need to really think about what are the things that are going to stop their availability, because they are the sorts of things that are going to impact on you most directly. That's probably it for now. Thanks, Leanne.
Thanks, Andrew. Probably go to Brianna next.
I want to sort of say what he said, but from my perspective, it's plan and resource. Plan as best you can for those scenarios, know what you're going to prioritise in terms of risk, and put the resources behind it that you can. Obviously, the resourcing component's a bit trickier for those in the for-purpose and not-for-profit space, but do the best that you can to leverage those networks. I think my second point would be to network and engage. Make sure you are tapped into the right networks, engaging with the right people, ensuring your voice is heard, so that when a crisis strikes, everyone knows who the right person is within that organisation to contact, and how we can tap them into mechanisms like TISN, like national coordination mechanisms, supporting through local communities, etc. And my third piece, which is fundamental both internally and externally, Communicate effectively. Ensure your team knows the plan. Ensure your team knows that you've done the planning. Ensure your team knows how to exercise the plan. And ensure the community has confidence that you've got this. I think what we have seen time and time again in natural disasters and in COVID and general times of crisis, there is a desperation for leadership, strong communication, that someone's in charge. Now that can be within your organisation, that can be within government, that can be within a trusted community leader, but to communicate effectively that we've got this, and if we don't got this, that we know how to get it.
Thanks, Brianna. And sorry, Sam, Andrew and Brianna are hard acts to follow with this one, but anything additional that you'd like to add?
Yeah, that was really cruel, Leanne, to let them both go first. But yes, you should absolutely do everything that Andrew and Brianna said. I think the risk identification is the most important place to start. Thinking about prioritising. Clearly, natural hazards are going to continue to smash us over the coming years, particularly in Australia. And as Andrew pointed out, the cyber threat is ever present. Effectively, we're all living on a floodplain in cyberspace. Assume it is coming for you and assume your doors are open. So I'd say that about hazards. On internal organisation, yeah, it's really the priority, I think, is having the conversation with your team, making sure people know who's responsible for what and who you, as Brianna said, who you connect with and who you need to connect with externally to get the information you need. And on that note, my third point I'd end with is a shameless plug for the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre. We're now on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter. Campbell will post those channels. So please do sign up, join up, follow, make sure you're connected with all the information that we're publishing. It's a community out there and we can help connect you in. If you haven't had a look at the risk management program that's being consulted on at the moment, have a look at that as well. There's lots of information on our website, really worth a look. If you have questions, do contact us and do follow. We are trying to gain followers. We're very new to social media. It's a dangerous space for government, so follow along and we'll see how we all go. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you, Sam. And yeah, we've been posting some information throughout the webinar about where you can go to the various websites, but echo Sam's comments about the LinkedIn and Twitter accounts for the Cyber Centre. It's great to have up-to-date information and to engage with them as much as you can. That will give you some great information also about TISN, the Trusted Information Sharing Network. I'm sure you'll join with me in saying thank you so much to all of our panellists today. It's been really engaging and a great conversation to talk about environmental security and particularly focusing on the lessons that you've learned, the insights you've gained from a lot of experience across disaster management, managing entities and organisations as you do, Brianna, and I thank you very much for that. Some of those key takeaways that I certainly got and those consistent messages for me was around the joined-up collaborative approach is really critical, the emphasis on planning and exercising and communication with your team. You can never do that enough. I work in an organisation where that's our bread and butter, and our staff are always still saying we want to communicate more, we want to understand more. So it just takes a lot of effort from our leadership groups to make sure that they continue that emphasis. But as we finish up, just a quick reminder for our next webinar, which is being held on the 17th of February. And there'll be an emphasis then on personnel and physical security. So we're trying to touch on all of those various protective security factors that affect critical infrastructure organisations and owners. So very keen to have you there. A final huge thank you to Sam GRUNHARD, Brianna Casey and Andrew Chandler for participating in our webinar with us today. And I would like to wish everybody a really safe and happy festive season as we move into the December period. And so thank you very much, everybody, and take care.